This afternoon, I'm going to touch base on 3 areas of optimization for franchisors that don't always get as much attention as they really should. But these are issues that we often work through with our clients as they try and become more efficient as a support organization. So the 3 areas I'm going to focus on is, first of all, how to open locations faster once the franchise agreement is signed. The second is best practices for benchmarking franchisee income statements and operational KPIs. Both Michelle and Greg have touched on the importance of sharing that information with franchisees as the franchisor support team tries to do a better job of focusing on franchisee performance financially. And then the third area is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we typically see as some of the typical spans of control for key staff positions within a franchisor organization. So what I'd like to start with is what Keith has here on the screen is for a brick and mortar business, whether it's retail, restaurant, et cetera, the typical sequence of events.
I'm sorry, Dave.
You can go back for the development of a franchise business. And what I'd like to do is just share a few best practices that we've seen from our clients or that we advise our clients on to optimize performance and to get locations open faster. And that's certainly an issue for a lot of franchisors as they're coming out of COVID. They may have had a lot of agreements signed in 2020 or going into 2021. And many of those are oftentimes with multi-unit operators. And so the faster they open locations, the more efficient they can become. So in terms of site locations, some of the best practices that we see is, if you're not already doing this, is to work with a market analytics firm like Buxton or IntelliView or GeoStrategies. There's a whole bunch of them out there, Forum Analytics in Chicago, to analyze markets in advance of approving franchisees. So before you start talking to a prospective franchisee in Chicago, Detroit, Columbus, Ohio, already map out those markets and know how many territories exist and which territories have the greatest potential for your brand so that you can get a jump on development even as you're talking to your prospective franchisees. Another thing you can do in terms of site location is identify and qualify at least one or sometimes multiple brokers in each market, again, in advance of having franchisees, so that when you have franchisees that you start approving for those markets, you can say, hey, here's 3 brokers that know our concept. They've already been up to speed through our training, and these are the people that you should work with. And then once you have an established broker network that is working well for you in a market, many franchisors will often require franchisees to work with one of the approved brokers. And I think that's fine as long as you give them some choice in terms of who they can select. But if you're trying to open locations quickly and you allow franchisees to find their own broker, that'll lose time. Then you have to train that broker. The broker they source may not be the one that's optimized for your business. So the more pre-work and advanced work you can do on the broker side, the better. You also want to make sure that the brokers your franchisees are using are incentivized financially. So we have a client that we're working with currently, for example. One of the things they do is that they tell the brokers that if they have to split commissions or if they have to take a reduced commission, the franchisor will actually make them whole, which keeps the broker more motivated to work on behalf of the franchise systems. Communication, as in all types of support, is also critical. So as franchisees are looking for sites, weekly calls with the franchisee and their broker is definitely a best practice. And ideally, when you go into the market, if you're making a site tour with the franchisee, you're not just doing that to look at one site, you're looking at multiple sites that they may be in the pre-work of negotiating LOIs on. In terms of lease development, requiring a standard letter of intent that franchisees use as a best practice. Again, it cuts down on time and it makes sure that what you want to get into the lease through the LOI gets in. Another best practice is to have standard lease addendums as an exhibit to your franchise agreement that franchisees are required to incorporate into their lease. In terms of store design, qualifying and pre-negotiating rates with architects and requiring franchisees to work with a designated architect as opposed to allowing them to source an architect that is new to your brand. It's not going to be as efficient. So you should have designated architects that franchisees are required to use. It's also good to involve franchisees early on in the design phase of their location so that they don't walk into the location during construction and say, hey, I'd like to put that sink here. I'd like to move that counter over there, and then disrupt the opening time frame. Also start preliminary design work as early as possible in the process. Some of our better clients, they will actually get the architects engaged at the stage where the lease is still being negotiated so that they're not losing time during that month or 45 days that the lease is being negotiated to start design work on the location. In terms of construction and optimizing that, it's important that you pre-negotiate rates on vendor pricing for things like equipment, millwork, flooring, lighting, et cetera, so that you can just tell the contractor at this stage in construction, this is when you order this from this vendor, this is when you order this from that vendor, instead of having the contractor going out and sourcing those materials. We've had more and more of our clients over the last couple of years move toward modular construction as well, including a lot of QSR concepts that we've worked with. So a lot of the components, including the building, can be made off-site and dropped in and built in a much shorter time frame. And the construction is actually much better, and oftentimes it comes in at a lower cost. You also want to make sure that you set minimum standards for contractors so that your franchisees are working with people that have experience building the type of locations that you operate. We've also, in the last few years, seen more and more franchisors source expediters for contractors to use for permitting, particularly in some states like California, Florida, or in the Northeast, where the permitting process, and again, this has been impacted through COVID, through labor shortages, et cetera, on the permitting side. The more you can be involved with that, the shorter the time frame to get those permits.
Dave, may I ask a quick question of you here?
Yeah.
So I'm looking at this, and this is a terrific layout of the sequence, and each of these, I'm sure, are very measurable in terms of getting to what we call days to first dollar. I'm wondering right at this point in time, though, as to whether or not you were seeing, because of labor shortages, because of the pandemic, is this impacting and elongating days to first dollar because of shortages in the turnaround and shipping of furniture, fixtures, and equipment?
Yeah, and I think Michelle touched on this too in what she was talking about earlier. Supply chain is certainly a potential disruptor of this process.
Sure.
So again, the more you can pre-order, and stack things to get things sooner to the locations, the better.
Thank you.
In terms of operations training, doing pre-training remotely with franchisees before they come to your location for training will make training more efficient, will shorten the training time frame that they need to spend with you at your location. So we always encourage that, as well as the use of a web-based learning platform like FranConnect has as part of their system as well. So Keith, if you can go on. Okay. The next thing I want to touch on is franchisee reporting of income statements. So the language that you see here is taken from a current franchise agreement for, I think it's a restaurant brand. And it's typical of what we see in a lot of franchise agreements, but it's outdated. And a lot of franchise attorneys have not updated the language to conform with best practices and the technology that's available to accurately benchmark income statement data. So the typical requirement in a lot of agreements is the franchisee needs to prepare their accounting according to generally accepted accounting principles, which is a wide range of what they may look like. The franchisor typically will give the franchisee a recommended chart of accounts. Some franchisees will adopt those, some franchisees will not. And then the franchise agreement typically says at the end of every month, you have to send us the statements. At the end of every quarter, you have to send it, and at the end of the year. These timeframes ideally should be maintained in the operations manual, not the franchise agreement, so that you can change those over times. But what's wrong with this approach is, first of all, the franchisor will be lucky to receive 20% of the financial statements on time. Most of those will not be accurate. It'll be very difficult to combine them into any type of database and share them back with the franchisee community. So in the end, nobody wins. The franchisor has to chase after the franchisees to get the statements. Some of the statements are sent to the franchisor. The franchisor typically can't do much with them, and the franchisees don't receive any feedback from sending their statements into the franchisor. So it's not benefiting the franchise system as well. So best practice for setting up franchisee accounting, if you can move on, Keith, is first of all to have a required accounting format. Every franchisee should be under the same chart of accounts, the same P&L format, the same balance sheet format. Ideally, all franchisees will also be using the same accounting software. Go on to the next one, Keith. Whether that's QuickBooks Online, Xero, other accounting packages. The next element is franchisees need to maintain the franchisor's required accounting standards. They need to follow the chart accounts. They need to generate income statements on a period or monthly basis, whatever the franchisor requires. And then the next element is very important. The franchisor or a third-party vendor should have direct visibility into the franchisee's financials. So through an API integration, the franchisor or a vendor should be able to go into the franchisee's accounting or into the franchisee's computer, pull out the accounting statements each month. They don't have to be sent by the franchisees. And then the franchisor, in the last element here, can put together a robust benchmarking platform. You can go to the next one, Keith, to share and benchmark KPIs from the accounting statements with the franchisees. In all of the agreements that we have the attorneys draft for our franchisees, our new franchisors today, we also recommend to our franchisors that they go out and they negotiate rates with a third-party outsourced accounting firm that they can recommend to new franchisees as they onboard with the franchise system. So there's pre-negotiated rates, the accounting firm knows the system, et cetera. And then if franchisees are not following the required standards after some time of trying to work with them to correct that, if a franchisee just isn't getting it, then the franchise agreement gives the franchisor the right to say, this isn't working, now you will migrate to the accounting firm that we designate, which again gives the franchisor assurance that good, accurate, timely financials will be available for each franchisee. You can go to the next slide, Keith. Okay. And so these are just examples. This is from the FranConnect platform of some KPI benchmarking. These are more operational focused in terms of metrics than financial. If you can go to the next slide, Keith. This is an example from Cavinci, which their system primarily focuses on benchmarking KPIs. But in an ideal world, if you have these processes established, a franchisee should be able to open up their laptop in the morning and see how their P&L last month compared to other peer groups established in the system for labor, cost of goods, rent, supplies, whatever the line item is on the P&L. It just gives the franchisor much, much better visibility. And why is this important? It's important because it allows the franchisor to be a much better business coach to its franchisees because it has the financial information before it goes on the field visit, before the field rep goes and meets with the franchisee and they can share and discuss this information. Franchisees will be able to benefit from being part of a system where they can compare themselves against their peers, which is one of the main reasons franchisees should want to participate in a franchise system. The franchisor will have a much wider range of data available to select for their item 19 disclosures. And if the franchisor ever raises capital or sells to private equity or whatever they do as an exit, somebody's going to come in and do due diligence on the level of financial statements that they have for each location. And if you have this type of a system set up, it's going to be much better due diligence process and it's going to increase the valuation of your company. We do a lot of due diligence work for franchisors, and those companies that do this kind of thing score much higher with the people that are looking to make that investment. Okay. The last thing I just want to touch on is some input that we have on the spans of control or staffing ratios within franchisor companies. Obviously, not all companies are the same. Staff ratios vary based on a lot of factors, including the industry in which the franchisor operates. Are you a restaurant or are you a home-based service business? The size of the system, how fast the system is growing, how spread out the system is in terms of geography, and of course, the franchisor's philosophy towards support. If you can go to the next slide, Keith. So these are just ratios that we have seen over the last 20, 25 years in working with our clients. And this is really staffing ratios for mid to larger franchisors. So in a typical franchise development staff, a single unit focus, each development person can typically handle 12 to 18 deals per year. And if the focus is on multi-unit development, depending on the size of the investment, it's lower, perhaps 5 to 8 deals per year, depending on the size of the investment. You can go to the next one, Keith. In terms of franchise business coaches, if you're primarily supporting single unit restaurants, we typically see that it's ideal to have one business coach for between 25 and 30 locations. If your goal in particular is to be on site at least 4 times per year, which we would consider a best practice for restaurants. In a multi-unit restaurant where your focus of support is more on the multi-unit owner and the ownership group and their operations team, as opposed to the individual store managers, you might have a business coach for between 10 and 15 different owner groups. In a territory-based service system, such as lawn care, home improvement, you might have one field coach for between 35 and 40 owner territories. Field marketing staff, this is usually for larger national organizations. They might have one person for every 50 to 100 people in the field. And is there one more, Keith?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And then overall, in terms of the franchisor staff to locations, typically, and again, if you have 150 or more locations, typically we see the range of one staff equivalent for every 7 to 11 locations. And again, this can all vary depending on a lot of factors, but in terms of general guidelines, this is what we see.